Hey folks, welcome back to another episode of Spilling Tea with the G's. Again, I'm Nick Galrakis, and with me, of course, my brother Steve Galrakis, talk about AYA cancer and what's going on in the community. And for this episode, we are delighted to have Dr. Mark Lewis with us, who is no stranger to cancer himself and is also an oncologist as well. So he brings a very interesting perspective on a multitude of things, which you'll find out in this session. He's also a Twitter superstar. So we have a lot to talk about with him and a lot to relate to with the AYA community as he's an AYAer himself. Steve, I'll throw it back over to you.
Yeah, it was really great conversation, Nick. I was really excited to get to talk to Mark, and he brings a really interesting perspective to the world of cancer and AYA cancer, and just the health field in general. So it was a great conversation. I hope everyone gets to enjoy this as much as I know we did.
Yeah, for sure. So another awesome episode. We're very thrilled and honored to have Mark with us. So hope you all enjoy it. Check it out. And again, please subscribe to Spilling Tea with the G's Elephants and Tea channel. This way you can get updates every time a new one comes out. So sit back, relax, and enjoy Dr. Mark Lewis. Thanks, everybody. All right. Again, thanks, Mark, for joining us on Spilling Tea with the G's. So let's get right into it. And you yourself are no stranger to cancer personally, obviously professionally as well, being an oncologist. But I think it'd be great, Steve and I follow you, but I think it'd be great for those that don't follow you, don't know who you are, to kind of just like tee it up for everybody on who you are, what you do, and behind the curtain of Mark Lewis, if you will.
Sure, absolutely. And it's such a pleasure to join you guys. Thanks for having me on your platform. So actually, my origin story begins in Scotland, and that's relevant not just because I can pull off a Scottish accent, but I moved to the States in 1987, thinking that I would only be here for 5 years. And the reason for that was, the reason that we came is my father was a professor of theology at the University of Edinburgh, and he got offered a 5-year appointment at a seminary in Austin, Texas. So we thought we were just coming for 5 years. What changed everything, and the reason I'm still here, is when you come to this country, part of the immigration process involves getting a chest x-ray. And this is actually a public health measure to find out if immigrants are carrying tuberculosis. And my dad's x-ray didn't show TB, and he was 42 at the time and presumably in good health. He was a non-smoker, for that's worth, but the entire right lung essentially was opacified. So there was a mass in his right lung. And, we talk a lot about breaking bad news in oncology, and it's actually, I think, an art that requires a lot of delicacy. This was completely the opposite of that. It was basically a government bureaucrat in the embassy saying, there's good news and bad news. The good news is it's not tuberculosis. The bad news is there's something desperately wrong in your right lung, and when you get to America, you should probably have it sorted out. Click. So we got to the US and basically immediately within 2 weeks had to engage with the healthcare system. And so my whole American experience has actually been seen through a prism of healthcare from that moment on. So my father unfortunately passed when I was 14 years old, a freshman in high school. And that's when I decided, in some ways, the timing was perfect, not his loss. But, when you're 14, you're sort of filled with adolescent angst. It was the grunge era. I was listening to a lot of, that kind of music. And I sort of conceived in a very, frankly, immature fashion that cancer is like my enemy. And, I sort of burned with this filial rage that, I wanted to take vengeance on it. But actually what was more formative is that my father's oncologist was extremely close with him, again, within a professional boundary, actually came to his funeral. And then kind of took me under his wing and said, listen, if you are really interested in being an oncologist, you should see what it's like. And so I got to work in his clinic every summer during high school and college. And so at first, I'll be honest, it was a little bit odd because these are the people that treated my dad. And I think at the beginning, they felt sorry for me, but I asked them to treat me just like they would treat anyone else. And so I was an employee there. I started as a medical assistant. At one point, I was an X-ray technician. And I really got to see oncology. And it's interesting, there's been a study in one of our journals where if you take a medical student and you put them in inpatient oncology, so in the hospital ward, at the end of just 2 weeks, they will leave less likely to go into oncology. If you take the same medical student and put them in an outpatient clinic after 2 weeks, they are more likely to choose oncology. And my point there is, even since my dad's treatment, I've seen the pendulum swing, and this is true in my own practice. The vast majority of it now is outpatient. Now, I realize for many of your audience, some of the really more serious AYA cancers, sarcomas, and leukemias and lymphomas can require a lot of inpatient treatment. So I'm not in any way dismissing that. But my point is, by seeing patients and their families walk in and out of clinic and get treatment under the guidance of my dad's oncologist, I learned that it's not all doom and gloom. And so I entered medical school with a lot of not just kind of experience, but optimism. And then the very first year of medical school, and I'd already kind of obviously pre-selected oncology, we had this lecture and they said, short of psychiatry, oncology will let you have, and again, in an appropriate way, the closest relationship with your patients. And I've certainly found that to be true. I mean, it borders on friendship. Of course, that makes losses extremely tough to bear. Sort of some of these relationships are extremely intense, and then there's a lot of grief. But it's really been so rewarding. And then the final piece of the puzzle is literally my first day of oncology fellowship. So once you do medical school and you do your residency in medicine, that's when you can then subspecialize in oncologist. So I was at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. My very first day, I had terrible abdominal pain, and you could say it was nerves. I actually thought it might be appendicitis. And when I got checked out, I actually had a high calcium level. And this is the moment that everything clicked for me, because we never could explain why my father had developed his cancer. They described it as sort of an atypical lung cancer is always how it was explained to us. And again, I think in the world of an oncologist, he's a great doctor. But what he didn't have was the advantage that I had, which was seeing 2 consecutive generations affected by high calcium. So my dad's entire adulthood, he'd had high calcium that had gone unexplained. He had terrible kidney stones. They told him, avoid dairy. He was doing all the right things. He was very fastidious about not having milk and cheese. He still had the kidney stones. And I knew just enough from my medical training that there's only 2 conditions really that can give you consecutive generations with high calcium. One of them is completely benign, and the other one is a tumor syndrome called multiple endocrine neoplasia type 1. So day 1 of my oncology fellowship, I said, this is it. This is what I have. It's like a eureka moment. My whole family all of a sudden made sense, including some other paternal relatives who had died from mysterious illnesses. So the funny part, or not so funny at the time, was I went to my internist who had been assigned at Mayo, and Mayo Clinic has a reputation of brilliant diagnosticians. And he diagnosed me with hypochondriasis because I was a first day oncology fellow who had just convinced himself he had a cancer syndrome. It does rather reek of paranoia. But I was able to sort of twist his arm. And here I know I was extremely lucky. And a lot of AYA patients have, I think, the experience of sort of feeling sometimes that they weren't listened to. I almost am ashamed of it. I played the doctor card. I said, listen, I'm your colleague. I have clinical rationale. I can't ethically order these tests myself. Please, please, please check me for this gene, because we know the mutation that causes MEN1 syndrome. Sure enough, that came back in a couple of weeks and I had it. So my entire oncology training, and again, I think this is actually something of a blessing, was viewed through this prism of having been very close to cancer with my dad, now having a cancer predisposition syndrome myself. And it really allowed me to see things from the patient side. I've not yet had chemo, so I can't pretend to know what that's like. I've not yet had radiation. I've had plenty of surgery, including a surgery that removed half my pancreas, which is pretty intense. But that really is my backstory. And I guess the other piece of the puzzle regarding social media, which we can get into, I've realized what a privilege I have to even be able to disclose my diagnosis. In some ways, I was a little bit foolish or hasty. So as soon as I was diagnosed, I was like, wow, this is hopefully a story people will find interesting. So I wrote it up in an oncology journal, and 2 people read it, my mother and my wife. And other than that, it was not exactly setting the world on fire. And then about a year later, I got a phone call from the New York Times. And I'll be honest, and this is a little inside secret, oncologists actually, for the most part, have a pretty good sense of humor. I think it's how we sort of balance out all the tragedy we deal with. And my fellowship, my trainee class, was extremely funny. I thought it was one of them playing a prank on me. So I nearly hung up on this person. I'm really glad I didn't, because it was legit. So every month in the New York Times magazine, they have a medical mystery. And the woman that writes it is Dr. Lisa Sanders. She's an internist at Yale. She was actually the chief consultant on the TV show House. And I'm a little bit upset because if House had gone on for one more season, I was actually going to be the subject of one of the episodes. So that was my one chance at stardom, and it's gone. But regardless, so Dr. Sanders kind of trawls through the literature looking for interesting cases, and she happened upon my self-diagnosis with this syndrome. So she said, I'd like to write you up as an anonymous case. I won't give away your personal identity, but I'd like to write you up as a case in the magazine. So sure enough, I did that. And I realized, by sharing the story of a diagnosis, I actually hope on some level it's helpful. So I'll say it again myself, as a doctor, we're human beings. We only make diagnoses if we think about them. So I thought I have a real chance here, not to sound heroic or anything, it's not, but I said I have a chance here to at least waive my confidentiality and be very visible as a patient with this particular disease. I helped co-found a Facebook group for patients with our syndrome. And then I was like, well, that's great, but that's closed and we want to maintain privacy there. What about a public platform? And Twitter came along at just the right time. So the most demonstrative I've been on Twitter is when I had my pancreatic surgery 3 years ago. Again, I thought, well, how can I, take this moment, that sort of painful thing I have to go through? How can I sort of look for the silver lining? And my employer here, Intermountain Healthcare, thankfully went along with my crazy scheme, which was to live tweet the entire thing. So in the week before the operation, the social media team here, which is very robust, got together with my surgeons, figured out how they could be in the OR and not disrupt the flow of the surgery, which takes about 6.5 hours. And you can now go back and see step by step the entire procedure. And the reason I did that is this is a procedure that works in all kinds of pancreatic cancer, but it's kind of a scary procedure. I say the surgeon does to the upper abdomen what Picasso does to faces. It sort of takes everything and rearranges it and makes it barely recognizable, takes out some pretty important stuff too. And I've actually had patients who are curable, but are so afraid of surgery that they forgo it. And I think monsters are more scary in the dark. And so I thought, well, if I can create sort of a step-by-step guide to what this looks like, hopefully that'll be demystifying and helpful to patients. And so I woke up from the operation and the Intermountain media team was like, yeah, 3 million people followed your operation online. And I was like, holy smokes. That's a lot of people to see inside you, by the way. But from then on, I've really leaned into being, you can say exhibitionist, but very demonstrative about the ups and downs of being a patient. And it's not, one thing I have learned, and I'm sure your listeners will agree, it's not linear. Like I think as a doctor, I sort of expected, even like recovering from surgery, I thought it was going to be a straight line, and it is absolutely not. It's been up and down. I've had some complications even years afterwards. But I'm also lucky that I have the insight into the patient experience, and I try to apply that to my practice and my online presence.
There is so much there that I am like wanting to dive into. Mark, watching Steve's face while talking about the live tweeting of your pancreas surgery. Steve, you have something you want to start with? Because I could go so many different directions.
Well, the only thing I thought of when you said you had 3 million people looking inside of you is a comment about dignity, because I'm not sure, all the times they've poked and prodded you, or how many times you poked and prodded your patients, but I have a specific memory that triggered in my head. And it was during my bone marrow transplant. I had some issues with my butt, and I had to have all these residents come in the room, and they all had to peer inside of me. And it was just like, wow, this is where I'm at right now. So yeah, 3 million people, man.
Yeah, exactly. And you can see my pancreas splayed out on the table. And it's actually, honestly, it's been literally an out of body experience for me to go back and look at that. One thing I did that I regret, and I'll explain why I mean this. I gave control of my Twitter account to the Intermountain team here, who did a great job. But some of my friends thought what they were doing was waking me up out of anesthesia every 15 minutes to comment and then putting me back under. So that caused a lot of alarm among people who care about me. And I had to clarify after the fact that no, thankfully I was under general anesthesia to have myself, split open from sternum to belly button. But yeah, and then honestly, when I woke up, I almost thought I was hallucinating. I had no idea it was going to have that kind of impact. And it's been really nice. Even years later, I've had folks reach out on the internet. We can talk about the pluses and minuses of social media, and there are plenty of trolls. But I've had people reach out and say, that was really helpful and helped me or a family member prepare for the surgery, or realize that it wasn't necessarily going to be smooth sailing immediately afterwards. A lot of patients are much less fortunate than me and have to go through the surgery and then chemo, typically in about 2 months post-op. And that's not a lot of time to heal from such a large intervention. So again, I do realize how fortunate I've been. And again, the people here could not have been more game. There's plenty of hospitals that would have thought this was like an absolute, PR nightmare. And it was about a 3% chance of dying on the table, which obviously would not have been great publicity. But my surgeons were just absolutely lovely about it. And to let someone into your operating room is sort of like the captain of the ship or the pilot of the plane letting someone watch them at the helm. And it's funny, I asked my surgeon if it bothered him, and his answer was remarkable. He said for the 6.5 hours of the surgery, he was only focused on the operative field and he didn't notice anything else. And apparently he just gets in this kind of zone, which is what you want from your pancreatic surgeon.
Yeah. Go ahead, Steve.
I mean, as you said, Nick, I don't even know. It's hard to pick a spot and go, but I guess I'm going to go with kind of, you're talking about the social media and the cancer here. So, obviously it's an incredible thing, one, to be so willing to be so open. I mean, truly, literally, and and metaphorically open to the world. And I know a lot of people get healing out of doing these kind of social media posts. Did you, and I don't know, did it help you come to grips with what was going on, or is it just to not play down what you did? I mean, but was there anything that I guess came out of it internally for you after this post?
Oh yeah,
before?
No, it's been extremely cathartic. Not just the live tweeting the surgery, but just being on social media altogether. So I'll say two things there. So one of which is, I think for AYA patients in particular, there's a sense of feeling like you're the only one with your disease. And so when I was diagnosed, I was at Mayo, so it was a great medical center, but there was no other patient there like me that I could interact with. The incidence of our syndrome is about 1 in 30,000. So odds were not in my favor that I was going to be running into people with my condition. So again, finding other people online that are kindred spirits, whether it's your specific disease or as far as AYA is concerned, demographic, I think is just so enormously helpful. And so I've found it basically a great antidote to isolation. It's a great antidote to self-pity. As an oncologist, honestly, I just have to walk into work and realize how lucky I am, because every patient under my care arguably is having a harder time than I am, and I'm blessed to take care of them. So it's been helpful personally and professionally. On the professional side, oncologists have a massive PR problem. So, and frankly, we've earned that over the years with extremely indiscriminate toxicity. Leukemia, of course, is sort of the poster child for brutal multi-agent chemotherapy dating back to Sidney Farber in the 1950s. And when I sort of had this horrible realization, it was a couple of years ago. So, Google will complete your search for you, right? So I typed in to the search bar, oncologists are, and I kid you not, it said oncologists are murderers, oncologists are criminals, oncologists are liars. None of it was favorable. And so I thought, again, I've got an opportunity here to sort of hopefully humanize the field a little bit. And frankly, what's ultimately going to help the most is showing patients that our treatments are getting less toxic and more effective. But also, I think there's this other notion that we're hiding the cure or we're just in it for profit. And I thought, we really have to show compassion and be quite vocal about it without, seeming too sanctimonious or holier than thou. Some of my favorite moments that I broadcast on Twitter have actually come from oncology conferences where we've been celebrating the ability to give less chemo, not more. So we had this big meeting every summer in Chicago, except for this year, called ASCO, the American Society of Clinical Oncology. And the way it works is you get basically 40,000 oncologists together in a room from all over the world. And they usually pick sort of the top 4 most important things for everybody to know. And the last couple of years, it's been the event on at least 2 occasions that the big announcement has been being able to give less chemo and not more. And to see the joy in that audience is really pretty remarkable and deserves to be shared. And I had a particularly ironic experience once where I had literally just come from that meeting and I was taking a taxi to O'Hare, and the taxi driver spent the entire hour that I was his captive audience telling me that oncologists are just in it for the money. And I was trying to make the argument that literally I just came from this huge auditorium where we were celebrating the opposite. But I get it. Chemo, no one should ever want chemo, When I consent my patients, I think my job is to convince them that they need it and that the benefits potentially outweigh the risks. But it's a tough sell, and it should be.
It's the conversation about you being an oncologist too, going through everything that you went through personally to get to that point. I think it's fascinating when you're starting that conversation too, right? Because I feel like people like Steve or those that have been through cancer can sit there and say, hey, Dr. Lewis has been through this. Mark's been through this with us. I do know plenty of oncologists that are fantastic and wonderful human beings. Frankly, I can't think of one off the top of my head that I've come across where I'm like, oh, that guy's a crook or that woman's a crook. But I'm sure, like as you like the stereotypes there, Steve might actually, now that I'm looking at his face, maybe not a crook, that's not the right word.
Crook, but yeah.
But difficult. We'll leave it at that. But
I'll tell you guys, when I was coming out of fellowship, I was interviewing at different places, and I won't use any names here, but one of the guys interviewed me, wanted to meet me at Starbucks, and he rolled up in a red Ferrari with a vanity plate. I think said something absolutely horrible, like Chemo MD or something. And he said, hey, listen, I want you to know it's not the 90s anymore. You're not going to make $2 million a year in oncology, but you'll do all right. And you'll see 40 patients a day in my practice, and you'll be well paid for it. And I thought, this is absolutely atrocious, and I want nothing to do with it. And as it happens, he's since been indicted for Medicare fraud. So I'm really glad I did not join that group. But to roll around in your sports car with a vanity plate that is advertising you profited off chemo is just like, that is awful. And so again, I'm no saint. I'm very lucky to have the job that I do. But I think people like that unfortunately have sullied our reputation. Chris Rock has a routine that there are some professions that can't have any bad apples. I think his joke was that American Airlines can't say that most of their pilots like to land the plane. So oncology is a field where we really, a couple bad actors, and there have been some really egregious episodes in research that we can talk about, unfortunately, again, have kind of brought the whole reputation down. The best or worst example of that was, and you may know this, but in the late 90s, there was a South African researcher who fabricated a ton of data suggesting that bone marrow transplant, Steve, you'll understand this all too well, was effective in breast cancer. And so again, at the same conference I was mentioning, I think it was 99, he stood up there and basically told lies and convinced the entire community, including the very active breast cancer advocates, this was the right thing to do. And so arguably thousands of women went through, and Steve, again, I'm not even going to speak to what transplant's like, you can, but went through this harrowing experience completely unnecessarily because one guy was just trying to, stroke his ego with attention and publicity. And things like that set us back so far that then we have to really, really work hard and be conscientious about ethical research conduct and then really involving patients in trial design just to kind of claw back our lost reputation there.
Wow. Wow. I didn't know about the South African doctor. So that's researcher. That's pretty wild.
Yeah.
And terrifying at the same time.
Yeah, exactly.
Speechless a little bit on that. I want to circle back to you personally, Mark, on everything that you do to help better the field, help better what you do. Do you feel like from everything that you went through with your father and even just coming to this country and working your way up through the ranks, I think that's what's really unique to me as well. The fact that you were working in the lab with the oncologists as whatever, really, as an X-ray specialist, technician, you kind of saw every aspect of what it takes to run an oncologist department, if you will. So I think that's unique in itself, not just obviously you having genetic cancer, but also working at the different levels on the way up.
Yeah.
So, did that really kind of help put the groundwork on you as an oncologist and how you operate?
Yeah. So first of all, it's a team sport. One of the things that happens possibly behind the scenes, but I'd like your audience to know about, is that at least at my hospital, we actually get together as a deliberately multidisciplinary group every week in what's called tumor board. And that's a phrase I think is probably well known. And at first it sounds a little bit sinister, actually, that all these people would gather around and look at your scans. And just like Steve was saying, it can seem very intrusive. But the reason we do it is that it's extremely difficult these days for one physician to know everything. And cancer management in particular requires, as you were saying, Nick, all these different people with all these different levels of expertise. And so the way our conference works, we actually have 12 of them here at Intermountain around various cancers. I run the one for GI cancers. So every Tuesday morning, I get together basically with about 24 other docs, and across all fields, so radiation, surgery, pathology, radiology, and we talk about cases. And I tell the patients, actually, I'm very overt when they are being presented, because I want them to know they're kind of getting a second opinion sort of built in. And that way they know I'm not making decisions in a vacuum. We're practicing, team science. So I learned that on the way up. The other thing I've learned is in academics, which is where a lot of the progress in oncology happens, there's enormous pressure to publish and to present. So one of the phrases is, you publish or perish. So you're supposed to be sort of cranking out manuscripts and showing productivity. The problem is, by the very nature you're doing research, you're not going to succeed at everything. So some of the things that seem very biologically plausible in concept then actually have no merit when you actually test them. That's why we do trials. But one unfortunate consequence of this system where you're sort of rewarded for productivity is not, it's not intellectual dishonesty, but there are certain phrases that have crept into the field that I think are extremely unfortunate. And the one that really gets me going and sort of jangles my nerves is manageable toxicity. Okay, so Steve, you might appreciate this. Oftentimes at an oncology conference, and this is understandable, there's a ton of focus on how much did drug X make the tumor shrink? How long did the patients getting drug Y go without growth? How long did they live? These are all very, very important metrics, and they're extremely concrete. What often gets swept under the rug is the side effects. And I cannot tell you how many times I've sort of had this, again, jarring mismatch of the data I'm seeing on the screen for the side effects and the speaker saying this was manageable toxicity. Because ultimately, even if you're not, conspicuously selling the drug, you're there trying to convince your peers that this is an intervention that is worthwhile moving forward. So it's in your favor to sort of emphasize benefit and sort of underplay side effects. But so often I've seen pretty horrible side effects just sort of dismissed with that language. And I learned this through my own error during my fellowship. So at Mayo is a center that treats a lot of multiple myeloma. It's actually where, among other people, Tom Brokaw went when he had myeloma. Regardless, a lot of the drugs in myeloma cause neuropathy, nerve damage. And there's actually a grading scale for neuropathy, which can go all the way to basically crippling neuropathy that puts you in a wheelchair, can make it difficult for you to breathe because the diaphragm is controlled by the phrenic nerve. Anyway, so one day I was presenting a patient to one of the myeloma experts there. And I made the mistake of using this phrase, and I've never used it since. I said, oh, he asked how the patient was doing. And I rattled off a bunch of clinical data. And I said, oh, and he has only grade 2 neuropathy. And he gave me, it was one of those moments if looks could kill. And I'm really glad he reacted the way he did, because it's stuck with me. You tend to remember your mistakes more than your successes, I find. And he said, never, ever put the word only before a description of patient side effects. He said, you would not want grade 2 neuropathy yourself. And he's right. It means persistent numbness and tingling. It doesn't go away and can potentially interfere with your dexterity and be very uncomfortable. And I thought, he's absolutely right about that. But because it was on a scale where it wasn't grade 3 or 4 neuropathy, that's why I was sort of minimizing it quantitatively or qualitatively. Regardless, that's what bothers me the most. And that's where I feel duty bound as a patient and arguably a patient advocate to speak up and sort of remind my colleagues from time to time that, hey, it's great that the drug is so effective, but the most effective drug in the world also has to be tolerable. One of my other sort of eye-opening moments at Mayo is there's a regimen that they use there for myeloma that has 7 chemo drugs in it. And the first time I saw the acronym, I thought it was a mistake. I was like, there's no way you can possibly give a human being this amount and have it be tolerable. And sure enough, that is what it is. But some of these regimens are just so nasty, and we should celebrate when they work, but we should equally celebrate when they have less impact on the patient's quality of life.
So Mark, is what you're telling me that the ASCO conference is basically like those commercials for like all the drugs they advertise, and they're like, this is all this great stuff, but at the end it causes anal leakage, and you're like, is it really worth it?
Yes. One of my wife's great observations is that you never see a happier couple than in a commercial for herpes medicine. They always look like they're just having the best time together, usually frolicking on the beach or jumping into a waterfall in Costa Rica. And it's a deliberate mismatch between the video and the audio, right? And even my kids are savvy enough, they're 9 and 12, to pick up that, these drug commercials are trying to sell you something great and then just kind of suppress all the horrible things, which usually include death. That's usually in there somewhere. And they like to just kind of hurry that through. So you're absolutely right. It's interesting. In oncology, the pharmaceutical industry has sometimes been demonized, and I think actually unfairly. Now, is there massive profit to be made? Absolutely. But so much of the science actually moves forward driven by collaboration between industry and you can argue academia. And a lot of it actually also happens out in the community. So again, one of the things about clinical trials that I also try to champion is you have to make them generalizable. Both my fellowship at Mayo, which is basically in the middle of Minnesota, and then my first job at MD Anderson in Houston, a lot of the patients I was seeing, and I don't mean this term to sound derogatory, but they were medical tourists. So they were coming from somewhere else, often with a rare disease, and often with very few options remaining to undergo, say, a clinical trial. Now that requires means. It requires the ability to be well enough to travel. And it requires the opportunity cost for you to leave your home and presumably even your workplace to go and do this. So I often got the sense that I was treating sort of a special class of patient. I hate to even sound like there's a caste system in oncology, but one of the things I realized is, and we do the same thing with our eligibility criteria, if you actually read a manuscript that describes the patients that go into trials, it's often so strict that it's very difficult then to generalize and apply it to practice. So the other thing I try to champion, especially here in my system, is research that is ultimately going to be accessible to lots of patients and not exclude people, especially on socioeconomic grounds. So that's another thing I'm a big fan of. And Intermountain, where I work, is really an interesting setup. So in terms of my professional life, I am actually licensed in 6 states, I think. So I work in Utah. Basically, every surrounding state, we have a presence virtually. And so I have to be licensed in those states. And so we try increasingly to take the treatments and take the trials to the patients rather than the other way around. One thing I noticed, Nick, when my dad was sick, was just what effort it took, even for him to drive, say, 20 miles and get traditional chemo, let alone drive hundreds or thousands of miles to go on a clinical trial. And in fact, at the end, when it was suggested he go to MD Anderson, he was too sick to do so. So I think it's really important to make research, again, accessible. The greatest trial in the world won't do anything if it doesn't accrue patients and if the results aren't then applicable back to the population.
Well, and one thing you said there, Mark, about making research applicable to a general population, because as you know, when you have a rare cancer, it costs millions, if not billions of dollars to develop medication.
Yep.
Unfortunately, it does, between research, paying people, supplies and all those things. Mm-hmm. And money has to be made back, right, unfortunately, in this world, right, just the way our society works, for better or for worse. And so when you have a rare disease, unfortunately, from an economic standpoint, companies can't justify investing billions of dollars if it's going to treat 400 people.
That's exactly.
And it's sad.
It's exactly right. And what that means is you kind of get double jeopardy, because not only do you have this rare disease and there might be fewer treatments, because they need return on investment, those products tend to be egregiously expensive. The best example I can think of, and I think it's actually the most expensive drug ever approved, there is a condition, I think it's a form of spinal muscular atrophy, so a horrible neurodegenerative condition largely affecting children, where you're right, there's only maybe a couple hundred kids affected. And I think the drug for it, if I'm not mistaken, costs something like $2 million per dose. Don't quote me on that, but it's definitely in that ballpark. It's astronomical. And you're right, it's sort of this inverse effect between prevalence and cost. The good news, and there is good news, is for some of these new drugs, what we've learned is traditionally the way we thought about oncology is in silos by where does the tumor start, right? And in fact, in adult oncology, we talk about the big four. This is solid tumors, so not leukemia or lymphoma. So the big four are colon, breast, and then lung and prostate. Those are the four in terms of prevalence. But what we've learned is even across those types, there can be shared mutations. So what I'm getting at is the drugs don't necessarily know the site of origin of the disease. Oftentimes they're targeting the driving mutations. So the good news there, Steve, is that when you find some of these commonalities, you can actually take a drug from a common cancer and apply it to a rare cancer and still benefit everybody. And that's actually
I know that's why the NIH has actually been pushing to get rid of the classification of cancers based on where it's at. 'Cause I know for the last, 10 years now, they've been trying to collect every type of childhood cancer that exists in the country to create a genetic roadmap to look at all the genetic mutations for all the different cancers.
Right. Yeah. And, honestly, we've sort of been limited by technology to date. So, the practice of anatomic pathology goes back, centuries, actually. A lot of it started in Italy. And so we've been very used to, okay, we're going to stick a needle in this and then look at it under the microscope. But now with the revolution that we've seen with genetic testing, if you think about it, I vividly remember writing a report in my high school science class on the Human Genome Project. That took over a decade. It took scientists in almost every developed nation, and it cost billions of dollars to sequence the human genome. We now do sequencing of similar magnitude in 2 weeks at the cost of just over $1,000. And it's just unbelievable. And it largely has to do with computer processors and also the fact that once they figured out the normal sequence, it was much then easier to see what was aberrant. But regardless, my point is, we can now see what mutations make these cancers tick in a way that was nearly impossible, say, 2 decades ago. And that's giving us, for some people at least, an Achilles heel. So the FDA, I think, now has, if I'm not mistaken, 4 histology agnostic approvals, meaning drugs that are approved not by the tumor type, but by what's making them tick, whether it's mutations or a particular profile that we can see. And that's really remarkable. That's completely different than the way I was taught, even 2009 is when I started my fellowship. So it's absolutely amazing to see how the field has changed, and it's only to the benefit of our patients, provided, of course, they can get the drugs they need.
Very cool. Very cool. We just listen to you talk about that all day, Mark, because a lot of that stuff, here we run our own organization for cancer patients. I didn't know half of that stuff. So that's fascinating for me. Steve's a bookworm and reads like everything under the sun, and he knows this stuff and the terminology. He has more of the science brain, where I have more of the marketing brain. So you can tell the conversations.
Perfect.
It balances out well. But no, thank you for all that. And I think we kind of warned you about the elephant in the room conversation, right? Yeah. We love to always ask our folks that give us their time, what is your elephant in the room when it comes to dealing with cancer? Is it something you already stated, or is it something else?
Yeah, I'll sort of springboard off something I said before. My elephant is language. Unlike almost any other disease, there's a vocabulary that slips into cancer that I think is arguably unfortunate. So I already talked about the manageable toxicity and how that phrase irks me. But honestly, the stuff that really gets me, and I realize it fits some patients, are all the metaphors around war and fighting. And arguably, we can partly blame Richard Nixon for this, because I think it was 1973 he declared the war on cancer. Didn't exactly clothe himself in glory thereafter, but regardless. So what bothers me the most is because a sad part of my job is reading my patients' obituaries. And I do that as a matter of habit. One is I almost always learn something about them I didn't know when they were alive. And this goes to show you how little time we have comparatively to get to know one another. I don't know, when you guys have been to the doctor, when they take a social history, what that usually means is, do you drink, do you smoke, do you do drugs? That's extremely reductive, and that's just a checklist of vices. It's not actually getting to know the person and their identity. So that's one reason I read the obituaries. But the thing that bothers me is that almost always, and you see this in the press too, you almost always see the phrase that they lost their battle. And the reason that bugs me is there's a sinister connotation, I think, that when you're fighting cancer, it has something to do with courage and willpower. Now, of course, there's a ton of courage involved but there's also courage involved in not accepting treatment. So one of the patients for whom I actually have the greatest respect is John McCain. And he's the perfect example. Actually, I wrote a paper about this called You and Whose Army, because he was obviously a decorated veteran, had been a prisoner of war. And at the very end of his life, not only, you might remember this was the summer of 2017, he had just come back from cancer surgery, and he went back to the floor of the Senate to cast the decisive vote on healthcare reform. So he literally put his money where his mouth was. And I just found that to be particularly courageous. But then at the end of his life, he actually went on hospice. All too briefly. One of the tragedies of hospice, and it sounds weird, is actually I think patients often aren't long enough to benefit, but regardless. The fact that he would do that as, again, a decorated military hero in this country, and someone that was well recognized for his military service, I thought really upended this whole notion of fighting cancer. And so again, I wrote about that. I'm happy to share that with you guys and your audience. But that's what bothers me. That's my elephant in the room. And there's lots of other, there's a multitude of problems, including in young people, the lack of fertility preservation, the lack of insurance coverage thereof for AYAs. But the one that really gets me the most across pretty much my entire patient spectrum, the youngest patient in my clinic is 50 and the oldest is 106. And there's a fair portion there, of course, are AYA, and sort of that's part of my niche practice. But that really bugs me. I do not like the fighting metaphor. I'm fine if that's what works for you as a patient, great. But it shouldn't be forced upon people. That sort of framework, I don't think, should be so ubiquitous in our field. You don't hear people fighting heart disease, fighting hypertension. It only tends to be cancer for some reason.
Yeah, I well said. You're presenting in our Gab Fest that when this airs, this will be the week of Gab Fest. And that was something that our partners at Lacuna Law, Mallory and Ariel, we talked about extensively, was making sure we phrase things a certain way. And that's where we came up with facing cancer. Everyone is facing cancer. And someone actually pointed out to, I can't remember if they pointed out to Mallory, but someone else was saying, looking at it from that standpoint of everyone's at a different phase of cancer, right? However you want to classify it, but everybody faces it. It's not a journey. I know people hate the word journey as well.
Oh yeah, I
feel like most journeys people choose to go on, not
exactly.
You have no choice. But I think you hit it too, where for us, at least at Elephant's Tea and me personally, it's like whatever that individual, however they want to classify it, I go, great. If you want to say fighting. If you want to say journey, whatever the case may be. But it's so true that we're definitely in a time of looking at the terminology and the language that is used. And frankly, where we fell flat on our face early on at Elephants and Tea was we've completely, when people sign up for our magazine, we would ask them, hey, if you'd be willing to let us know, are you a survivor? Are you a patient? Are you a caregiver, et cetera, et cetera? We left out metastatic. Yeah. And a lot of people lashed out at us, and rightfully so, just from the standpoint of, hey, I am not in treatment. I am not a survivor. Mark, you're kind of in the same boat with that category. It's like I have cancer, but I'm not currently a patient, because if I was speaking to like patient, you are in the hospital, you are in treatment. Yeah. And so it's the language and the certain terminologies are used. You do have to be very careful and making sure that we do it correctly.
So can we just call it being a draftee?
That's right. You get conscripted, right? Yeah.
You're getting conscripted. There's no choice, or you're draftee.
Yes, exactly. Well, one thing I wanted to say there, Nick, and I'm really excited to talk about this particular aspect at GabFest, is I'm of two minds about bell ringing ceremonies. So on the one hand, it can be a wonderful way for someone to sort of mark the end and understandably celebrate a phase of treatment. But on the other hand, there are plenty of patients who never get to ring the bell. I will say, again, it's particularly moving to talk about it today. Just before I talked to you guys, I logged onto Twitter, and a patient who I started taking care of at MD Anderson 5 years ago is today ringing the bell to celebrate his 5-year survival. And so to log on to social media, you can say social media is frivolous, but that moved me to my core, and I was so thrilled to see that. And once you move on from a practice, you typically actually don't get continued access to the medical records. I actually had no idea how he was doing. So to see that was wonderful. By the same token, I've had plenty of patients tell me how disturbed they are when they hear the bell ringing. So let's say they're in infusion in a chemo suite, which is another euphemism I'm not wild about, getting treatment for incurable cancer, and someone else is there ringing the bell, quite literally, audibly, and very demonstratively. I think that's got to be so hard. So I used to think that the bell ceremony was universally good, and now I kind of see it from both sides. And I don't really know what the right answer is, to be honest.
Yeah, definitely. Steve, I saw your facial expressions on that too.
Well, I've beat my first two cancers, defeated. I don't know how to describe anything for anybody anymore, but didn't get to ring anything. There was nothing to ring, and also, without even, that's actually one of my, I didn't even think about the bell as being an elephant in my room, but it definitely is, because of the notion that you're done.
Right.
That you're like, your last treatment's over and life goes back to normal.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And for those metastatic patients, for those leukemia patients, sorry, am I better, Nick, or am I still muffled?
Little muffled still. Your mic sounds a little muffled. That's all right. It's good enough.
That just threw me off.
No, I think the thing is that
it's a frustrating thing because it doesn't end. For most of us, if you have toxicity, if you have other issues, or if you had regular forms of chemotherapy or radiation, you're going to have side effects.
Right.
And for me, as I have learned, unfortunately, cancer didn't end the day my treatment started. And in reality, and we could talk about this for a long time, cancer began when my treatment ended.
Gosh, that's profound.
Yeah.
So to me, for me, there's no end. And so it's this notion of, it's a life.
Yep.
Yeah. I don't know.
Again, I have certainly not been through anything nearly as harrowing as what you've gone through, Steve, but I hear you in the sense that I don't really have an endpoint either. I am genetically mutant. I try to convince my son, who's got the mutation for me, that that's cool, like the X-Men. But on the other hand, it means that literally every cell in my body is programmed to go awry. And I don't look at the bell ringing as sour grapes. I just think you're right. I think it's sometimes a false sense of finality. And actually, I've had some patients look back and really rue celebrating the end of treatment when they recur. And that's really, really hard, not just for the people that were hearing them, but even for that patient themselves. One guy said he was, quote, too cocky in celebrating and sort of felt like this was karmic. And I was just like, oh. So yeah, the bell ringing, we'll talk about at GabFest, but I really do think you can look at it from both angles.
Steve, any curveballs for Mark?
Well, I do, but it might be too deep, might be too intense. But it's up to Mark if Mark is up for a deep question.
Sure.
So you raise the notion of having a cancer come back after the bell and all of this thing, having that fear. And I recently had a conversation with someone about hoping that your cancer comes back.
Wow.
Or hoping that because there's a comfort of being in the hospital.
I see.
There's a comfort of being in that place. The life becomes, all the bullshit goes away and it becomes very focused.
Yeah, very black and white. Yep.
Yeah, and I guess my question for you is, as someone, is that something you've ever thought about?
Here's how I'll frame it. I do see my patients, let's say they have gone through a discrete phase of treatment. So a perfect example is for a lot of my colon cancer patients who are, say, stage 3, so they had the cancer cut out, but it was in their lymph nodes, and now we're concerned about recurrence. It's very common for me to give them 3 or up to 6 months of chemotherapy as essentially an insurance policy. It's not foolproof, but we know it dramatically reduces the likelihood of recurrence, okay? What I've found, and we'll get into the pandemic in a second, is they sometimes are profoundly unsettled to finish their treatment, because just like what you're getting at, Steve, there is a almost perverse comfort in coming to treatment because it's very regimented. You come every 2 weeks, and the sense of doing something. And I think what we're really getting at here is the fear of disconnection and the fear of inaction. And actually, I think it's a real tragedy if we make our patients feel they only matter to us when they're on treatment, then I think we're doing them a real disservice and setting them up for that kind of psychology. What's been interesting.
One thing I'd add to that, Mark, actually, is I think it's also, you're searching, you're waiting for that cancer to come back.
Yes.
So when it does, it's a relief of, I know where it is.
Yes, exactly. So I've actually described that as a Pyrrhic victory, meaning that if you achieve remission, but live in constant fear of recurrence, that comes at a great mental cost, doesn't it? And so what's been fascinating during the pandemic is actually, especially back in March and April, during the first of heaven knows how many surges we're going to have now, a huge number of our visits, especially follow-ups, were conducted just like this. So we thought, on the oncology side, actually, we thought this is great. We can use telehealth, we can do virtual house calls. We don't have to bring these particularly vulnerable people into clinics and put them at risk of exposure. So my sort of de novo sense was that AYAs in particular were going to love this. I thought, we've got digital natives, we've got people who live their lives online on Instagram and are used to FaceTime, and it turns out we just did a survey, and I think the results will be published soon, that 1/3 of our AYAs were profoundly dissatisfied with doing a visit like this. And the reason I'm bringing this up in regards to your question, Steve, is that apparently what they missed was the tangible and intangible things, but being in a room with their oncologist. One of my partners is like me. She treats only one cancer, and instead of it being GI, it's breast cancer. And so a huge part of her follow-up visits with these patients is actually the physical examination of the breast and the lymph nodes. And apparently her patients have been absolutely petrified that if they do a telehealth visit, then the onus of responsibility is on them to detect their own recurrences. And so apparently anxiety of that for many of them, not all, but a substantial portion, has really sort of negated the convenience, if you want to call it that, of doing these virtual visits. So it's been really fascinating. Once again, we've got to listen to the patient. Some of the things that we think are just absolutely brilliant conceptually turn out to be profoundly dissatisfying or upsetting. And you only know if you asked. So I think that's been really interesting. And I think it kind of gets into your question. So I've never wanted a recurrence, but I did feel very cared for in the intense period of time that I was in the hospital. And I do see in my patients all the time this sort of sense. One of them described it to me perfectly. The feeling when you've been on a treadmill and you step off and it feels like your legs should still be moving, but they're not. That's how they felt getting off the treadmill of treatment. And sort of they were just disoriented, not to be coming every 2 weeks anymore. That was their rhythm. And well, no one ever wants chemo. Some people actually are very, very nervous to come off of it.
Well, and we could probably spend a long time talking about this. But I do know for me, and it's still probably a disturbing thing for my family, is that I like being in the hospital. It is a very comforting environment to me. ER, not so much, but like inpatient, there's a really bizarre comfort to just knowing that I can hit a button and someone's there to take care of a health issue or something, or just, I don't know. It's a weird thing.
Yeah, no, I actually can hear you on that. I'm lucky in that my wife is a physician, so I actually kind of get some of that care at home. The best example was, and this is going to sound weird, bear with me. So this was about 4 weeks after my surgery. The biggest problem I had, other than pain, was my stomach stopped working. So the stomach is directly adjacent to the pancreas. So even if you don't cut the stomach, and my surgeons didn't, they upset the nerve that controls the stomach. It's called the vagus nerve. It's essentially the pacemaker for the stomach. So there's this condition called delayed gastric emptying, and it's unpredictable who it's going to happen to or for how long. So my surgeons, actually, who I see on a regular basis, like to joke with me that they've had some 86-year-old patients waltz out the hospital with no problems. The relatively young oncologist was the one that gave them all a huge headache. So anyway, multiple times after my operation, I actually had to have a tube put down my nose to drain bile out of my stomach. And so what I'm getting at here, Steve, is the morning of my birthday. It was 5 a.m. The last place I wanted to go was the ER. And my wife, as an absolute act of mercy, put this tube down my nose. And it was the best birthday present I've ever had. The sense of relief, and to your point, being cared for, was wonderful. She's basically my boutique doctor. And
did you get on your knees and kiss her feet afterwards, man?
Right, exactly. Well, once I stopped vomiting bile, yes. And the really funny part is she's a pediatrician, so she's used to doing this on kids. And I guess this wasn't funny at the time because I was pretty sick, but as she was threading this tube in my nose, she exclaimed, "Your nostrils are huge," which one of the funnier moments of our marriage. You know, when you get married, you take the vows in sickness and health, but you don't quite envision a moment like that. So that was pretty great. And now we look back and laugh on it.
Well, that's just fantastic. I don't even know how we can. That's
End it. Cut it.
Yeah.
End it.
Mic drop. Yeah.
That is, how many people can sit there and say that they had bile drain out of their stomach at home by their wife?
Right.
I just don't think.
Even my surgeon was amazed. He was like, "She did what?" And you know, he had sent us home with all the equipment. She's a trained physician, just like I am, and apparently I'm a much easier target than the kids that she normally treats. So there you go.
Gosh, I'll have to tell my wife's a nurse practitioner for kids, so I will have to originally in the ICU, so I will have to say, hey, if I ever need this, can you pull this off? Wow. Well, Mark, thank you so much for joining us. This
Absolutely.
has been fantastic, and I learned a ton today. I think I just enjoyed just sitting back and listening to you and Steve talk most of the time. That's, as Steve knows, I'm usually doing most of the talking between the two of us. So this was great. I can just sit back and enjoy. This was awesome. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you again for everything you do. But this is a lovely platform to talk about AYA issues. And it's funny, I feel a little bit of a fraud because I did recently age out of being an AYA. I'm now 41. So even with the most generous definition, I don't qualify anymore. I'm an elder statesman, hopefully. My son calls me a boomer. I think that's the term. But anyway, I feel really grateful to be involved in this community. It certainly has been a huge source of connection and support for me at times and my family. So thank you guys for everything you do.
Of course. Thank you for all that
Thank
you
you,
do
Mark.
too. So, all righty. Well, thanks again, Mark. And to everyone else, we will be back with our next episode the following week. Take care.